Marcus Thompson had been planning this London vacation for 3 years, working double shifts at his warehouse job in Detroit, saving every penny. He finally had enough money to fulfill his childhood dream of visiting England. The 28-year-old had always been fascinated by British culture, especially the royal traditions he had seen in movies and documentaries. On his 3rd day in London, Marcus decided to visit Buckingham Palace. The morning was crisp and clear, perfect for sightseeing. He wore his best casual outfit, a Detroit Lions jersey and khaki pants, and carried his prized possession, a small bottle of his grandmother's homemade hot sauce that he took everywhere. His grandmother, Rosa Thompson, had passed away the previous year, and this special hot sauce recipe was all he had left of her memory. As Marcus approached the palace gates, he was amazed by the grandeur of the building and the precision of the guards standing at attention. Their red uniforms, tall black hats, and serious expressions made them look like living statues. Marcus had heard that these guards never broke character, no matter what happened around them. He pulled out his phone to take pictures, but the battery was almost dead. Frustrated, he asked a nearby guard if he could help him take a photo. The guard, trained to remain silent and motionless, ignored his request completely. Marcus tried again, speaking louder, thinking the guard hadn't heard him. Other tourists began to gather, watching this unusual interaction. Some laughed at Marcus's attempts to get the guard's attention. Feeling embarrassed and slightly annoyed, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He thought about the stories he had heard about people trying to make the guards laugh or react. Maybe if he did something unexpected, the guard would help him. Marcus reached into his backpack and pulled out his grandmother's hot sauce. He had been eating fish and chips earlier and had the bottle handy. In his mind, he thought a tiny drop of hot sauce might surprise the guard just enough to get his attention for a photo. It seemed harmless, almost like a prank. What Marcus didn't understand was the serious nature of the Royal Guard's duty. These weren't actors or performers, they were active military personnel responsible for protecting the royal family and royal property. They underwent rigorous training and took their responsibilities with utmost seriousness. As tourists continued to watch and some even encouraged him with cheers, Marcus made his fateful decision. He approached the guard slowly, unscrewing the cap of the hot sauce bottle. The guard's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but his training had taught him to be aware of everything happening around him. Marcus raised the bottle, intending to put just a small drop on the guard's glove. But as he moved closer, his hand shook with nervousness. Instead of a tiny drop, a substantial amount of the potent hot sauce splashed across the guard's pristine red uniform, and some even reached his face near his mouth. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. The hot sauce was not ordinary. It was Rosa Thompson's special recipe, made with ghost peppers and habaneros. The guard's eyes began watering instantly, and despite his training, he couldn't help but react to the burning sensation. His face turned red, and he began coughing. Within seconds, other guards rushed to the scene. Tourist phones were out, recording everything. Marcus stood frozen, the hot sauce bottle still in his hand, finally realizing the magnitude of what he had just done. The laughter and cheers from other tourists quickly turned to shocked silence as they understood this was no longer funny. The guard who had been doused was clearly in pain, trying to maintain his composure while dealing with the burning sensation. His fellow guards immediately called for backup and medical assistance. Marcus could see the anger and concern in their eyes as they surrounded him. Palace security appeared within moments, along with metropolitan police officers who were always stationed nearby. Marcus felt his heart racing as he realized his innocent prank had turned into a serious international incident. The bottle of his grandmother's precious hot sauce fell from his trembling hands, shattering on the pavement. As the situation unfolded, Marcus began to understand that he had not just pranked a tourist attraction performer, but had actually assaulted a member of the British military while they were on duty protecting the royal family. The gravity of his actions hit him like a wave, and he knew his dream vacation had just become his worst nightmare. The police officers moved swiftly and professionally. Within minutes of the incident, Marcus found himself surrounded by uniformed personnel who were clearly not amused by what had transpired. The lead officer, Sergeant William Davies, had been working palace security for 12 years and had seen many tourist incidents, but nothing quite like this. Marcus tried to explain himself, his Detroit accent thick with panic as he spoke rapidly about his grandmother, the hot sauce being a family recipe, and how he meant no harm. His words tumbled over each other as he attempted to make the officers understand that it was just a mistake, a prank gone wrong. The affected guard, Lance Corporal James Morrison, was being attended to by medics who had arrived on scene. They were flushing his eyes with saline solution and checking for any skin irritation. Morrison, despite his obvious discomfort, maintained his military bearing and provided a clear statement about what had occurred. His voice was hoarse from the burning sensation, but his account was precise and factual. Sergeant Davies informed Marcus that he was being arrested under suspicion of assault on a member of the armed forces and criminal damage to military property. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Marcus felt the reality of his situation crash over him like a cold wave. The tourists who had been laughing and recording earlier now watched in stunned silence as he was led away. The police van ride to the station was surreal for Marcus. He kept thinking about his grandmother Rosa and how disappointed she would be if she knew her precious hot sauce recipe had gotten him arrested in a foreign country. He thought about his job back home, his apartment rent that was due next week, and his return flight that was still 5 days away. At Belgravia Police Station, Marcus was processed with the same efficiency that the British system was known for. His fingerprints were taken, his photograph captured from multiple angles, and his personal belongings catalogued. The desk sergeant, a stern woman named Inspector Claire Richardson, read him his rights under British law. The booking process was thorough and intimidating. Marcus had never been arrested before, not even for a traffic violation. The fluorescent lights, the echo of voices in the corridors, and the constant sound of doors opening and closing created an atmosphere that was both bureaucratic and threatening. During his initial interview, Marcus met duty solicitor David Wright, a tired-looking man in his 50s who had handled countless cases involving tourists who had found themselves on the wrong side of British law. Wright explained the serious nature of the charges Marcus was facing and the potential consequences. The assault charge was particularly concerning because it involved a member of the military while on active duty. British law took such matters very seriously, especially when they occurred at royal residences. Wright explained that this wasn't just a simple prank gone wrong. It could be classified as an attack on the Crown's protectors. Marcus learned that the incident had already made local news. Videos taken by tourists were circulating on social media, and the story was being picked up by news outlets both in Britain and internationally. His face was becoming recognizable, and not for reasons he had ever imagined. The interview room was small and sterile, with white walls and a metal table bolted to the floor. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins conducted the formal interview, asking detailed questions about Marcus's intentions, his background, and his understanding of royal protocol. Her questions were fair but pointed, designed to determine whether this was truly an accident or something more sinister. Marcus answered honestly, explaining his fascination with British culture, his savings for the trip, and his grandmother's influence on his life. He showed photos on his phone of Rosa Thompson and explained the significance of the hot sauce recipe. Detective Collins listened carefully, taking notes and occasionally asking for clarification. The interview revealed Marcus as someone who was genuinely remorseful and clearly hadn't understood the seriousness of his actions. However, ignorance of the law and cultural differences weren't defenses against the charges he was facing. The detective explained that regardless of his intentions, the impact on Lance Corporal Morrison and the disruption to royal security were real and significant. The hours passed. Marcus began to understand that this incident would have lasting consequences far beyond his vacation. His employer back in Detroit would need to be notified about his extended absence. His family would worry when he didn't return as scheduled. Most importantly, his actions had genuinely hurt another person and disrupted important security protocols. The holding cell was sparse and uncomfortable, with a thin mattress on a concrete shelf and a small sink in the corner. Marcus sat there through the night, replaying the events over and over in his mind, wondering how a simple desire to take a photograph had escalated into international headlines and criminal charges. He thought about Lance Corporal Morrison and hoped the man was recovering from the hot sauce incident. Wright visited him again the next morning to discuss options and next steps. The case would likely proceed to magistrate's court, where Marcus would face formal charges and potentially enter a plea. The solicitor explained the court process, the possible sentences, and the diplomatic considerations that might come into play given Marcus's American citizenship. By the morning after his arrest, Marcus Thompson had become an unwitting international sensation. The video of him dousing the Royal Guard with hot sauce had been viewed millions of times across social media platforms. News outlets from CNN to the BBC were covering the story, with headlines ranging from American tourists' royal blunder to hot sauce attack at Buckingham Palace. Marcus first learned about his newfound notoriety when David Wright, his solicitor, arrived at the police station with a stack of newspapers and a grim expression. The tabloids had been particularly creative with their headlines, and Marcus's mugshot was printed alongside photos of the incident. Some papers had even managed to track down information about his grandmother Rosa and the family hot sauce recipe. The American Embassy in London had been notified of Marcus's arrest, as was standard procedure for American citizens detained abroad. Consular Officer Jennifer Martinez arrived that morning to meet with Marcus and assess his situation. She explained that while the embassy could provide assistance and ensure he was being treated fairly, they couldn't interfere with the British legal process. Marcus's family back in Detroit had learned about the incident through social media before any official notification reached them. His sister Angela had been tagged in dozens of posts showing her brother's arrest. She immediately called their mother, Patricia Thompson, who was devastated to see her son's face on the morning news shows. The Detroit Free Press had picked up the story, interviewing neighbors and co-workers who described Marcus as a quiet, hard-working man who had been excited about his first international trip. His supervisor at the warehouse, Bill Henderson, told reporters that Marcus had been a reliable employee for 8 years and had worked extra hours to afford his London vacation. Back at Buckingham Palace, the incident had created ripples through the security apparatus. Lance Corporal Morrison had recovered from the hot sauce exposure, but required medical documentation for his military records. The palace press office issued a brief statement confirming that an incident had occurred and that the matter was being handled by appropriate authorities. Social media reaction was mixed and intense. Some users found the incident hilarious, creating memes and jokes about American tourists and hot sauce. Others were outraged, viewing it as a disrespectful attack on British institutions and military personnel. The hashtag #HotSauceGate began, trending worldwide. Marcus's public defender Wright received dozens of calls from media outlets requesting interviews and statements. He declined all media requests, knowing that any public comments could potentially harm Marcus's case. However, the legal team realized they needed to prepare for the possibility that this case would be tried not just in court, but in the court of public opinion. The incident sparked broader discussions about tourist behavior, cultural sensitivity, and the line between harmless pranks and criminal activity. British morning television shows featured debates between cultural commentators, legal experts, and tourism officials about how such incidents should be handled. In Detroit, Marcus's neighborhood became a focal point for news crews seeking to understand the man behind the headlines. His apartment building manager, Mrs. Chen, described him as a polite tenant who always paid his rent on time and helped elderly neighbors with groceries. The portrait that emerged was of an ordinary working-class man whose moment of poor judgment had spiraled completely out of control. The story took an unexpected turn when Rosa Thompson's hot sauce recipe became a subject of interest. Food bloggers and recipe websites began speculating about the ingredients that could have caused such a strong reaction in the Royal Guard. Some entrepreneurial individuals even began selling bootleg versions of what they claimed was the Royal Guard hot sauce. Marcus's case began attracting attention from various advocacy groups. Some American tourist rights organizations argued that he was being treated too harshly for what was essentially a cultural misunderstanding. British military veterans groups, conversely, supported the serious treatment of the charges, emphasizing that guards protecting royal facilities should never be subject to any form of assault, regardless of intent. The diplomatic implications were minor, but noticeable. The incident became a talking point in discussions about American-British relations, though both governments downplayed any broader significance. The British Foreign Office issued a statement emphasizing that the incident involved one individual and didn't reflect on American-British friendship. Wright began receiving calls from other solicitors and barristers offering assistance, as well as from individuals claiming to represent Marcus's interests. The high-profile nature of the case meant that everyone wanted to be involved, but Wright was careful to maintain focus on achieving the best possible outcome for his client, rather than seeking publicity. Marcus himself was struggling to process his sudden fame. In the holding cell, he couldn't access social media or see the full extent of the coverage, but Wright kept him informed about developments. The knowledge that millions of people around the world were discussing his mistake was overwhelming for someone who had lived a relatively private life. The American media began reaching out to Marcus's employer and family members for interviews. His mother, Patricia, a church secretary who had never spoken to reporters before, found herself fielding calls from national news networks. She declined most interviews but did release a brief statement through her church pastor, expressing the family's regret for the incident and their hope that her son would be treated fairly. As preparations began for Marcus's court appearance, the legal team realized they were dealing not just with a criminal case, but with a media spectacle that had taken on a life of its own. The challenge would be ensuring that justice was served based on the facts of the case rather than the circus of public opinion surrounding it. The Westminster Magistrates' Court was buzzing with unusual activity on the morning of Marcus Thompson's first appearance. Media crews had gathered outside since dawn, their cameras and microphones creating a gauntlet that Marcus would have to navigate. Inside the historic courthouse, additional security measures had been implemented due to the high-profile nature of the case. District Judge Margaret Thornfield, a veteran of 23 years on the bench, had handled countless cases involving tourists and minor incidents at royal sites. However, she had never presided over a case that had attracted such widespread international attention. As she reviewed the case files that morning, she was acutely aware that her handling of the proceedings would be scrutinized far beyond the courtroom walls. Marcus arrived at court in a transport van, wearing the same clothes he had been arrested in 3 days earlier. The sight of the media crowd was overwhelming. Cameras flashed as he was escorted through the courthouse entrance, his face showing the strain of his confinement and the weight of his situation. David Wright walked beside him, shielding him from shouted questions from reporters. The courtroom itself was packed. Beyond the usual court officials and legal personnel, the public gallery contained journalists from major news outlets, representatives from various advocacy groups, and curious members of the public who had queued early for seats. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation. Crown Prosecutor Helena Clark rose to present the charges against Marcus. She outlined the facts of the case in clear, precise language, describing how the defendant had approached a serving member of the British Army while on guard duty and deliberately applied a caustic substance to his person and uniform. She emphasized that Lance Corporal Morrison had suffered physical discomfort and that the incident had disrupted security protocols at a key royal site. Clark presented video evidence from multiple tourist phones showing the incident from different angles. The footage was clear and undisputed. Marcus could be seen approaching the guard with the hot sauce bottle and deliberately applying its contents. The prosecutor argued that regardless of the defendant's claimed intentions, his actions constituted assault and criminal damage. When Wright stood to respond, he faced the challenging task of defending actions that were captured on video and witnessed by dozens of people. His strategy focused on Marcus's character, his lack of criminal history, and his genuine remorse for the unintended consequences of what he maintained was a misguided attempt at humor rather than malicious assault. Wright presented character references from Marcus's employer, neighbors, and church pastor back in Detroit. These testimonials painted a picture of a hard-working, community-minded individual who had never been in trouble with the law. The solicitor also emphasized Marcus's immediate cooperation with authorities and his obvious distress at the harm he had caused. The cultural context became a significant part of Wright's argument. He explained that American tourists often had different understandings of royal protocol, and that Marcus had genuinely believed he was engaging in harmless interaction with what he thought was a ceremonial figure rather than an active military guard with serious security responsibilities. Judge Thornfield listened carefully to both presentations before addressing Marcus directly. She asked him to stand and explain, in his own words, what he had been thinking at the time of the incident. Marcus's voice shook as he spoke about his grandmother, his excitement about visiting London, and his profound regret for his actions. Marcus told the court about Rosa Thompson's influence on his life and how the hot sauce represented his connection to her memory. He explained that he had never intended to hurt anyone and that he now understood the serious nature of the Royal Guard's duties. His testimony was emotional and appeared genuine, bringing some sympathy from observers in the gallery. The court heard from Lance Corporal Morrison, who appeared in civilian clothes to give his victim impact statement. Morrison described the burning sensation he experienced and the professional embarrassment of being unable to maintain his post due to the incident. However, he also acknowledged that he believed the defendant's actions were misguided rather than malicious. Morrison's testimony was particularly powerful because of his measured professional demeanor. He explained the rigorous training Royal Guards undergo and the pride they take in their duties. His description of the physical effects of the ghost pepper hot sauce made it clear that Marcus had caused genuine harm, even if unintentionally. Medical evidence was presented showing that Morrison had suffered temporary but significant irritation to his eyes and skin. While there were no lasting physical effects, the incident had required medical treatment and had been documented in his military service record. The prosecution also presented evidence about the disruption to palace security protocols. The incident had required additional guards to be deployed, had necessitated medical response, and had created a security concern that took resources away from their primary protective mission. Wright countered by presenting evidence about Marcus's financial situation and the sacrifices he had made to afford his London vacation. He argued that his client was not a wealthy tourist treating the incident lightly, but a working-class individual whose dream trip had turned into a nightmare due to a momentary lapse in judgment. The solicitor also presented research about cultural differences in understanding royal protocol, suggesting that American tourists often lacked proper education about the serious military nature of Royal Guard duties. He argued for cultural education programs rather than purely punitive measures. As the proceedings continued, Judge Thornfield had to balance several considerations. The case had attracted international attention, meaning her decision would be scrutinized globally. She needed to ensure that justice was seen to be done, while also considering the proportionality of any sentence to the actual harm caused. The judge also had to consider the precedent her decision might set for future cases involving tourists and royal sites. Too lenient a sentence might encourage similar incidents, while too harsh a punishment might seem disproportionate to what many viewed as a cultural misunderstanding. During a recess, Marcus sat with Wright, discussing the possible outcomes. The solicitor explained that sentences could range from a fine and community service to several months in prison, followed by deportation. The uncertainty was agonizing for Marcus, who was beginning to understand that his life would never be quite the same regardless of the court's decision. Judge Thornfield took a 30-minute recess before delivering her verdict, using the time to carefully consider all aspects of the case. The courtroom remained packed as spectators, journalists, and legal professionals awaited her decision. Marcus sat nervously beside Wright, his hands trembling as he contemplated his future. When court resumed, Judge Thornfield began her remarks by acknowledging the international attention the case had received. She emphasized that her decision would be based solely on British law and the specific facts of the case, not on media coverage or public opinion. Her tone was measured and serious as she began to outline her reasoning. The judge found Marcus guilty on both charges, assault of a military officer and criminal damage to Crown property. She stated that while she accepted his testimony about his intentions and believed his remorse was genuine, the law was clear about the consequences of such actions regardless of intent. The video evidence was unambiguous and the harm caused to Lance Corporal Morrison was real and documented. However, Judge Thornfield also considered the mitigating factors Wright had presented. Marcus's clean criminal record, his immediate cooperation with authorities, his genuine remorse, and the cultural misunderstanding all weighed in his favor. She noted that he was clearly not a career criminal or someone who posed an ongoing threat to public safety. The sentence reflected this balance of considerations. Marcus was given a suspended prison sentence of 4 months, meaning he would not serve jail time unless he committed another offense within 2 years. He was also ordered to pay substantial fines totaling $5,000, including compensation to Lance Corporal Morrison and costs for the disruption to palace security operations. Additionally, Marcus was required to perform 120 hours of community service upon his return to the United States to be verified by British consular officials. The judge also imposed a 5-year ban on Marcus visiting any royal residences or properties, and required him to attend a cultural awareness course about British institutions and law. As the sentence was read, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and devastation. Relief that he wouldn't be going to prison, but devastation at the financial cost and the lasting restrictions on his freedom. The $5,000 fine represented more than 6 months of his warehouse wages, and he had no idea how he would pay it. Judge Thornfield concluded her remarks by addressing Marcus directly. She acknowledged that he had learned a harsh lesson about cultural sensitivity and the serious nature of royal protocol. She expressed hope that his case would serve as an educational example for other tourists about the importance of respecting British institutions and law. Outside the courthouse, the media response was immediate and intense. Wright made a brief statement on Marcus's behalf, expressing gratitude for the court's consideration of mitigating factors and confirming that Marcus would comply with all aspects of his sentence. He declined to take questions, hustling Marcus quickly into a waiting car. The reaction from various stakeholders was mixed. British military representatives expressed satisfaction that the court had recognized the seriousness of assaulting service members, even in cases of cultural misunderstanding. Tourist advocacy groups argued that the sentence was appropriate given the circumstances, balancing accountability with recognition of Marcus's genuine remorse. Back in Detroit, Marcus's family received news of the verdict with mixed emotions. His mother Patricia was relieved he wouldn't be imprisoned, but worried about how he would afford the substantial fine. His sister Angela began researching fundraising options, though she worried about drawing additional unwanted attention to the family. The story of Marcus's sentencing became another wave of international news coverage. Some commentators praised the British justice system for its balanced approach, while others argued that the sentence was either too harsh or too lenient, depending on their perspective. The case became a touchstone for discussions about tourist behavior, cultural sensitivity, and proportional justice. Marcus faced immediate practical challenges beyond the legal consequences. His original return flight had long since departed, and he needed to arrange new travel. However, his passport had been retained by authorities during the legal proceedings, and he had spent most of his remaining vacation money on legal fees and extended accommodation costs. The American embassy assisted with emergency travel documents, but the process would take several days. Marcus found himself stranded in London with very limited funds, unable to afford decent accommodation and facing the prospect of sleeping in budget hostels or even on the streets. A surprising development came when several London residents, moved by news coverage of Marcus's situation, began reaching out to offer assistance. A retired couple, John and Mary Patterson, who lived in South London, offered Marcus a place to stay until his travel arrangements were finalized. They had been following the case and felt sympathy for someone they viewed as a good person who had made a terrible mistake. The Pattersons' generosity extended beyond just accommodation. John, a former bank manager, helped Marcus understand his options for paying the court-imposed fines. Mary, who had worked as a social worker, provided emotional support during what was clearly the most difficult period of Marcus's life. During his extended stay in London, Marcus began to see the city differently than he had as an excited tourist. He visited local job centers to understand how community service worked in Britain, spoke with legal aid organizations about payment plans for his fines, and even visited the area around Buckingham Palace to better understand the context of his actions. The hot sauce incident had opened Marcus's eyes to cultural differences he had never considered. He began reading about royal history, military traditions, and the serious security concerns that surrounded protecting the royal family. His ignorance, he realized, had been profound and dangerous. Local news crews occasionally spotted Marcus around London, but the initial media frenzy was beginning to die down as other stories captured public attention. However, Marcus knew that internet searches of his name would forever bring up the hot sauce incident, affecting his future employment prospects and personal relationships. As arrangements for his return to Detroit finally came together, Marcus reflected on how completely his life had changed in less than 2 weeks. He had arrived in London as an anonymous warehouse worker, excited about his first international adventure. He was leaving as someone whose face was recognizable around the world, facing years of legal and financial consequences for a moment of incredibly poor judgment. Marcus Thompson's return flight to Detroit was a stark contrast to the excitement he had felt on his journey to London 3 weeks earlier. Seated in the economy section of a half-empty aircraft, he stared out the window during takeoff, watching the British countryside fade below him. The passenger beside him recognized him from news coverage and spent the entire flight either staring or trying to secretly take photos with her phone. Detroit Metropolitan Airport felt both familiar and foreign when Marcus finally walked through the arrival gates. His sister Angela was waiting for him, along with 2 reporters who had somehow learned of his return flight. Angela quickly escorted him through the terminal, declining to answer shouted questions about his experience and future plans. The ride home to Marcus's East Side apartment was quiet and tense. Angela filled him in on developments he had missed, including the fact that his story had become something of a local sensation in Detroit. Local radio shows had been discussing the case, and several Detroit-area hot sauce makers had tried to capitalize on the attention by creating their own versions of what they claimed was Rosa Thompson's recipe. Marcus's apartment felt smaller than he remembered, and everything seemed slightly different after his extended absence. Bills had piled up on his kitchen table, and his refrigerator had been emptied by Angela to prevent spoilage. The normalcy of his living space contrasted sharply with the international incident that had dominated his life for weeks. The financial reality of his situation became clear immediately. The $5,000 in court-ordered fines and legal fees had wiped out not just his vacation savings but also his emergency fund and forced him to max out his credit cards. Currency conversion made the debt even more substantial in American dollars, and he faced the prospect of years of repayment on his warehouse worker's salary. His employer, Great Lakes Logistics, had held his job during his extended absence, but Marcus could tell that his supervisor, Bill Henderson, was uncomfortable with the attention the situation had brought to their workplace. Co-workers treated him differently, some with curiosity, others with judgment about his actions. The easy camaraderie he had enjoyed at work before his trip was gone. Marcus's first day back at work was awkward and difficult. Several co-workers had seen the viral videos and news coverage, and he found himself constantly explaining what had really happened versus what had been reported. Some colleagues were supportive, understanding that he had made an honest mistake, while others seemed to view him as someone who had embarrassed Americans abroad. The community service requirement proved challenging to fulfill in Detroit. British consular officials needed to verify his completion of the court-ordered hours, which meant finding approved organizations and maintaining detailed records of his volunteer work. Marcus began volunteering at a local veterans center, finding the work both meaningful and ironic, given that his offense had involved a military service member. Working with veterans gave Marcus new perspective on his actions in London. Many of the men and women he served meals to had stories about military service and the pride they took in their duties. Their conversations helped him understand more deeply why Lance Corporal Morrison and his colleagues took their protective responsibilities so seriously. The 5-year ban from royal properties meant that Marcus's dream of returning to explore more of British culture was indefinitely postponed. This restriction felt more painful than the financial penalties, as it represented the loss of future opportunities to make amends for his mistake and to experience the country he had genuinely wanted to appreciate. Internet searches of Marcus's name continued to bring up the hot sauce incident as the top results. This digital footprint began affecting other aspects of his life. A woman he had started dating ended their relationship after Googling him and deciding she didn't want to be associated with someone who had international legal troubles. Landlord seemed hesitant when he applied for a better apartment. 6 months after his return, Marcus received an unexpected letter from Lance Corporal Morrison. The British soldier had written to express appreciation for Marcus's community service, work with veterans, and to share that he harbored no personal ill will about the incident. Morrison's letter was gracious and professional, acknowledging that mistakes happen and encouraging Marcus to learn from the experience. The letter from Morrison prompted Marcus to write his own letter of apology, which he sent through official military channels. In it, he expressed his deep regret for his actions and his new understanding of the serious nature of military service and royal protection duties. The exchange helped Marcus feel that he was making genuine amends rather than just fulfilling court requirements. Marcus's family dynamics also shifted as a result of the incident. His mother Patricia struggled with the embarrassment of having her son known internationally for poor behavior, especially within their church community. However, over time, the experience brought the family closer together as they supported each other through the difficult period. The incident sparked Marcus to make other positive changes in his life. He began taking evening classes at a community college, partly to improve his employment prospects, but also to better educate himself about international relations and cultural sensitivity. His studies gave him tools to understand how his actions fit into larger patterns of cross-cultural misunderstanding. A year after the incident, Marcus had paid down about half of his debt from the legal proceedings. He had been promoted to a team leader position at the warehouse, partly because his supervisors appreciated his work ethic and dedication during his difficult period. His community service hours were nearly complete, and he had developed meaningful relationships with veterans he served. The hot sauce incident became a defining moment in Marcus's life, but not in the way he had initially feared. Rather than destroying his future, it forced him to grow in ways he never would have otherwise. He became more thoughtful, more culturally aware, and more appreciative of the opportunities and responsibilities that came with international travel. Marcus often thought about his grandmother Rosa and wondered what she would think of how her special hot sauce recipe had changed his life. He imagined she would have been disappointed in his actions but proud of how he had worked to make amends and learn from his mistake. The bottle that had broken on the pavement outside Buckingham Palace had contained the last of her original batch, but Marcus had since learned to make the recipe himself, understanding now that it wasn't just about the ingredients, but about the love and care that went into creating something meaningful to share with others.